Hi everyone. In our previous videos, we have provisioned the application architecture using Terraform. So we have tried deploying policies, custom policies, and built-in policies. We have enabled update management solution. We have also deployed the VNets and the servers and everything. Now, something which we have still lacking is this server, SQL server and the database. And while we are provisioning a SQL server in a database, and it can have a public endpoint. We can have a public access to this databases, and or we can have private, only the private network to communicate. When I say private network, is nothing but the VNet. Only VNet should be in a position in the internal network should be in a position to communicate with the SQL server. And that's where we are actually going to create a SQL server and a database, and then we are going to create a private endpoint for the SQL server. And once that is done, we will proceed with the further sections of creating a backup solution for any of the VM. And then we'll also create alerting rules and accordingly automation runbooks to proceed further. So let's jump into how do we create a SQL server. So I'll go to Google and I'll start searching for, I'm going to create a Microsoft SQL server. So you have to be very careful in terms of choosing the resources because there are different types of, there's MySQL, there is MS SQL. If you see MS SQL and we have MySQL database, we have PostgreSQL database, we have SQL database, and we have MariaDB. So we are going for a Microsoft SQL database here. And the way to create a Microsoft SQL database is just go and copy this. And I'm going to create a new text file. I'm going to paste it here. And I'm going to name this as Terra app. And I'm going to create this in the same application resource group. So I'm going to keep it in the same location and going to remove the tags here. We can have set up an authentication for a SQL server. So if I go into the SQL servers and I click on create, I can have the authentication method using Azure AD or SQL or SQL authentication. People, most of the organizations prefer the Active Directory only. But as of now, I'm going to enable the SQL server. So I'm going to remove this and I'm going to mention SQL admin and going to leave the minimum TLS version as 1.2, and I'm going to name this as app-ms SQL server. And once this is good in place, I also have to create a database for this SQL server. So I'm going to mention database here, and I'm going to copy this. So we have SQL server and we have a database here. I'm going to copy this. So I have to be careful. It's MS SQL database, and I'm going to use Terra-app database, and I can actually mention this as app SQL server. SQL DB, and there the resource group where this has to be created as in the same. So the server ID is going to be reference to MS SQL server Terra app, and I can leave this as it is, or I can remove all this at this point of time. The maximum GB also I'm going to remove this. I'm going to remove this, and I can even remove the SKU if I wanted. to avoid the confusions at this point of time. So it will create a general purpose a V2 core database, and this should be good enough. So I can save this. So one more thing which I have to take care is when I select all files here and I mention SQL.tf. So this will help me in creating the database, and I can also choose to create a private endpoint for this. Why should I create a private endpoint for my database? Because I don't want a public access to be enabled for my database, and usually organizations prefer that kind of security configuration. So let's disable a public access to our SQL server. How can we disable a public access to our SQL server? If we go and search here, network access enabled. By default it is true, so public network access, I'll keep it, make it to false. I'll go here and I'll mention equal to false. Now when this happens, no machines can even access this SQL server because there is no even private connection to this. Right now we disabled public access. Doesn't mean that the server is having access to the private network. To make that happen, we have to configure this server in this subnet. So how do we do that? So I'll go into the network.tf, and network.tf is here, and I have to create a separate subnet for my DB. So how will I do that? I'll copy this and I'll mention here DB, and the database name is DB. Enter that virtual network is the same thing, and it should be for address prefix should be of 4, and so we have disabled the private public access here. So how do we link our MS SQL server with the subnet which we have created just right now, which is DB subnet? So using the private endpoint, we can do this. So I'm going to create, so I don't want to create more files at this point of time, but yes, we can actually create one file specifically for private endpoints and do that. But at this point of time, as it's just one service, I'm aware that other than the virtual machines, only one service is there which needs a private endpoint. So that is SQL Server. So I'm just going to use Terraform here and mention private endpoint, and we have an Azure private endpoint here, and I'm going to take this subnet and use this here, and I'm going to mention that the private endpoint as Terra app DB, and SQL DB endpoint. And I'm going to mention that the endpoint should be created in the resource group itself, and the same resource group. The subnet where the endpoint should be referenced is. So what is private endpoint? It means that it's going to get a private IP address from this subnet, and that too for a service, Azure service. So that's where is private endpoint, and I can go and set up a private link here. So this one, SQL DB endpoint, and I can mention here that the service which I wanted to link is nothing but the my Azure SQL server. So I'm going to copy this and paste it here and copy this Terra app, mention this apps admin here, and the connection is false. I leave it to this, and let me look at if I have anything more. Doing service, you have to be a bit careful. Is private connection ID, resource areas, and sub resource names. So there I'm going to mention sub resource names, SQL server, and this should be good enough. But I want this to be created after the uh, and if I check this, now I do a Terraform validate. It's working. Now, doing if you try to deploy this entire thing, it's going to take us some time. So when you're trying to actually practice, I recommend the solution is create a folder for yourself. So I'm going to create a folder here specifically. Now, and this is where I have the file. So I just need at this point of time uh, some specific network. So I'm going to choose this SQL DB. This is sufficient. So I just wanted to check whether the database is getting created or not properly. And so I can actually create a folder here and I can create this. Because if I want to deploy the entire network or when I was trying to test, it's going to take some lot of time for me to make that happen. So instead you can actually uh, create only specific services which you wanted. Oh, I already have a database in place, so I can use that database because previously when I created it, I already created a DB, so there is no point to have this. That's a good one. But anyways, if we can have this, if we see, we have one network, and we'll have the SQL DB, which will get created there. But only thing is, I have to just take care of referencing should be deleted. So I can just test it easily when I was taking uh, while I was wanted to check whether it is working or not. So if I go back into this and say SQL, and this fails, I have to just do a Terraform init, and I have to just do Terraform plan. One more thing which is very important to understand is I want these machines to communicate with SQL database. So when that has to happen, it has to be that this subnet should be the backend subnet should be able to communicate with the SQL server services. So for that, we need to have a service endpoint in place. So if I go and research Azure RM subnet, and I look for service endpoint here, so I do a control F service endpoint. Oh, here we have it, service endpoint. So I have to copy this only to the backend, only to the machines. And here I have to just mention Microsoft.SQL. This should suffice in terms of communication. And also, while I was creating in this the subnet, the private endpoint, I also have to ensure that this subnet database should have private endpoint. So if I look for private endpoint, and yeah, if you see enable or disable network policies for private endpoint on a subnet, setting this to true will enable the policy, will false will disable the policy. And I would like here private endpoint. So this is would it's fine. So, but I'm looking for private link, and in order to deploy a private link service on a given subnet, you must set the attribute private links enabled to false. Network policies enabled. The setting is only applicable control network security group. So when we have an NSG, we can do this. But at this point of time, I can actually use enable enforce. So this is seems good. Okay. Just give me a minute, guys. So there are no changes in the subnet level as of now, because one thing which I researched here is, which I have the confusion is, do we have previously we used to have one specific parameter called enforce private link endpoint network policies. Why does that need to be there? but by default it was true, so there was no issues. But in case right now I'm not using any NSGs between this networks, and if you are using NSGs and all that, I definitely will use it. At that point of time, you need to actually ensure that these controls are been in place, and you have to even use ASGs to ensure that the only these specific machines are only being connected to SQL Server. The rest of the machines should not be in a position to connect to SQL Server. So let's get into this. At this point of time, I'm going to say that I'm going to leave that everything as it is. The private link policies are enabled as true. So if I try to do right now the Terraform plan, and I just did a Terraform validate, and when I was doing Terraform validate, I have got this error because I just took this couple of files, and the only changes which I have done is this database should be, I already have a subnet for that, and that is the reference which I have used. So when I copied the files, it was previously Terraform subnet DB, and I removed that DB, so it was saying that there is no DB subnet actually. So just I changed this, and that is how it has not throwing any error, and it's showing me what are the resources which are being deployed at this point of time. Now, if I do a Terraform apply hyphen auto approve, and let's wait for 2-3 minutes for the deployment to complete. So the deployment got completed without any errors. I could actually go back to the home screen and refresh my screen and look at SQL servers. There is an app SQL server. And if I look at the networking sections, the public access has been disabled. And if I look at the private endpoint, I have a private endpoint. If I click on this private endpoint, this is the one which has been created in AppC India, and it is in the subnet called VNet. There are three subnets, or four subnets. Yeah, we have database, backend, LB, app gateway, frontend. Now, if we look at this one, there are all 251 IP addresses available, but this one right now it has been assigned to the database. That's the reason why we don't have right now one more IP address available. We have only 250. So we look at this, and the SQL server is having this endpoint here. And so that is what it is. So the database we have here, the database. And once you try to create this, the same thing from the main script, you should be in a position to test your connections from this machines to this machine, as is an internal network, and it should allow. But in case if you are using NSGs and all that, please use ASG, also application security group, to ensure that you can route the requests from specific machines to only the SQL server. And that's the most optimal way and the efficient way to actually manage the infrastructure. Thank you guys. So ensure always to delete your infrastructure using Terraform destroy. So stay tuned for more videos. In the next videos, we'll try to enable backup solution for the machines. We no need to have a backup enabled for the SQL Server. By default, SQL servers are being backed by full backup differential backups and incremental backups. And in case you can actually prefer the option of replication, your servers to be, your databases to be replicated to other regions, and you can actually choose that to have ensure that high availability is in place. Whenever there's a database failure, you can actually use your read copy, or you can use replication servers to actually enable read from the other regions. Now, at this point of time, so I'm not actually choosing any backup here, only for the machine. Let's choose the application servers, this backend servers to be having backup enabled. And then I'll going to enable diagnostic settings for all these services and create alert rules accordingly. Thank you.